The Great Betrayal of Portugal. Ferdinand Magellan returned to Portugal from his successful expeditions in the east, expecting royal recognition and advancement within the Portuguese maritime hierarchy. However, his relationship with King Manuel I gradually deteriorated as the monarch grew suspicious of Magellan's activities during his service in Southeast Asia. Portuguese court officials began questioning whether Magellan had engaged in unauthorized private trading that violated his military obligations, though these concerns developed over time rather than immediately upon his return. The growing tension between Magellan and the Portuguese crown would ultimately force him to make a decision that would change the course of world history. King Manuel I's court became increasingly unwelcoming toward Magellan as doubts mounted about his conduct in the Eastern Territories. The Portuguese monarch had built his reputation on maintaining strict discipline within Portugal's colonial administration and viewed any irregularities with deep suspicion. Magellan found himself excluded from planning sessions for future expeditions and denied the promotions that his experience and achievements should have warranted. Portuguese officials began treating him with growing coldness, making it clear that his future prospects within Portugal's maritime establishment were limited. Facing professional stagnation and seeking to restore his standing, Magellan developed a revolutionary proposal that he believed could advance Portugal's imperial ambitions while securing his own position. He presented King Manuel I with detailed plans for reaching the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean instead of following the established eastern route around Africa. Magellan argued that this western passage would provide Portugal with a faster and potentially more profitable alternative to their existing supply lines that required dangerous journeys around the Cape of Good Hope and across the entire Indian Ocean. His proposal included sophisticated calculations showing how western routes could reduce travel times to the Spice Islands while avoiding the established Portuguese infrastructure that required constant maintenance and defense against competing European powers. Magellan presented maps showing theoretical passages through or around the American continent that would provide direct access to the Pacific Ocean and the lucrative Asian markets beyond. He argued that Portugal could establish Western colonies that would complement their Eastern Empire while creating redundant supply lines that would protect against potential disruptions to their existing trade networks. King Manuel I made the fateful decision to reject Magellan's Western route proposal, dismissing it as too risky and potentially counterproductive to Portugal's established Eastern expansion strategy. The Portuguese monarch argued that Portugal's existing network of colonies and trading posts represented proven investments that required continued support rather than speculative alternatives that might drain resources from successful operations. King Manuel I's rejection demonstrated his conservative approach to imperial expansion and his preference for consolidating existing gains rather than pursuing untested strategies that carried significant risks of failure. The rejection devastated Magellan's hopes for advancement within the Portuguese system and convinced him that his homeland had made a strategic mistake by refusing to consider alternative approaches to reaching Asian markets. Portuguese archives reveal correspondence showing Magellan's growing frustration with what he viewed as short-sighted decision-making by Portuguese officials who failed to recognize the potential value of Western exploration. These documents demonstrate his increasing conviction that Portugal was missing a historic opportunity to expand their global dominance through innovative navigation strategies. Magellan made multiple unsuccessful petitions to King Manuel I throughout 1517, each time requesting reconsideration of his Western route proposal or alternative assignments that would utilize his extensive experience in Asian waters. Portuguese court records show that these repeated requests were consistently denied, with officials citing concerns about resource allocation and strategic priorities that favored continued investment in established Eastern operations. The pattern of rejections made it clear that Magellan had no future within Portugal's maritime hierarchy, regardless of his past service or navigation expertise. The rejected navigator made his dramatic decision to renounce Portuguese citizenship in 1517, formally severing his ties to the homeland that had refused to support his revolutionary exploration plans. This renunciation represented an unprecedented act of defiance against the Portuguese crown and effectively branded Magellan as a traitor in the eyes of his former countrymen. Portuguese officials interpreted his citizenship renunciation as confirmation of their suspicions about his questionable loyalty and unreliable character. The formal break with Portugal eliminated any possibility of reconciliation and committed Magellan to finding alternative patrons for his western expedition plans. Magellan undertook the risky journey to Seville, where he would present his proposal to Spain's Charles I, knowing that approaching Portugal's primary rival constituted an act of treason that could result in his execution if Portuguese agents captured him. The journey to Spanish territory required careful planning to avoid Portuguese surveillance and potential retaliation by agents loyal to King Manuel I. Magellan carried detailed maps and navigation charts that represented Portuguese state secrets, making his defection an intelligence opportunity for Spanish imperial planners who had long sought inside information about Portuguese exploration techniques and territorial claims. Charles I of Spain recognized the strategic value of gaining access to Asian markets through routes that would bypass Portuguese-controlled territories and trading posts. Spanish officials viewed Magellan's defection as an opportunity to challenge Portuguese dominance in global trade, while simultaneously advancing Spanish territorial claims in newly discovered regions of the world. The Spanish court approved Magellan's proposal and began assembling the resources necessary for an unprecedented Western expedition that would test whether the globe could be circumnavigated by ocean travel. This betrayal of Portugal created the conditions for history's first attempt at global circumnavigation, but the expedition that Charles I would authorize carried dangers that extended far beyond the perils of unknown oceans. Charles I of Spain granted Magellan 5 ships on March 22, 1518, but this fleet carried the seeds of its own destruction from the moment crews stepped aboard in Seville. Spanish sailors made no effort to hide their contempt for serving under a Portuguese commander who had betrayed his own homeland to serve their crown. The men questioned how they could trust someone who had abandoned Portugal when it suited his ambitions. Whispered conversations in taverns and aboard ship centered on fears that Magellan might betray Spain just as easily if circumstances changed during their voyage. These suspicions created an atmosphere of mistrust that poisoned relationships between officers and crew members before the expedition even departed Spanish waters. The Spanish crew's resentment toward their Portuguese commander intensified as they learned more about Magellan's background and his reasons for seeking Spanish patronage. Sailors discovered that their captain had faced questions about his conduct during service in Portuguese colonies, leading them to question whether Charles I had made a terrible mistake in trusting this foreign opportunist with Spain's resources and reputation. Spanish officers complained privately that qualified Spanish navigators should have received command of such an important expedition rather than a Portuguese exile with questionable loyalty. The crew interpreted Magellan's appointment as evidence that their king valued foreign expertise over Spanish competence and patriotism. Charles I ruled not only Spain but also the Holy Roman Empire, creating complex political pressures that influenced his decision to support Magellan's Western expedition despite the obvious risks of employing a Portuguese defector. The young monarch needed to demonstrate Spanish strength and independence from Portuguese dominance in global exploration, while simultaneously managing the competing demands of his European territories. Charles I recognized that successful Western routes to Asian markets could provide Spain with economic advantages that would strengthen his position in European politics and reduce Spanish dependence on Portuguese-controlled trade networks. His support for Magellan represented a calculated gamble that Western exploration could transform Spain into a global maritime power capable of competing with Portugal's Eastern Empire. Analysis of crew manifests completed in 2025 reveals the remarkable diversity of expedition members who joined Magellan's voyage from ports across Europe and North Africa. The 270 men included Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, Germans, French sailors, and even North Africans who brought different languages, customs, and loyalties aboard the 5 ships. This multinational composition created communication barriers and cultural conflicts that complicated Magellan's efforts to maintain discipline and unity among his crews. The diversity meant that officers needed to give orders in multiple languages, while managing competing national interests and personal motivations that varied dramatically between different groups of sailors. Captain Juan de Cartagena emerged as the leader of Spanish opposition to Magellan's authority, using his position as Inspector General appointed by Charles I to question the Portuguese commander's decisions and undermine crew confidence in their leader. Cartagena argued that Spanish interests should take precedence over Magellan's personal ambitions, and that Spanish officers deserved greater influence over expedition planning and execution. His opposition would later manifest in documented plotting during their stop at Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where Spanish resistance to Portuguese leadership began organizing into more serious challenges to Magellan's command authority. Letters discovered in Spanish archives and analyzed using 2025 digital restoration techniques reveal the depth of anti-Portuguese sentiment that infected the expedition from its earliest planning stages. Spanish nobles wrote to Charles I expressing concerns about entrusting Spanish lives and resources to a Portuguese exile whose motivations remained suspect despite his promises of loyalty to the Spanish crown. The correspondence shows that influential Spanish courtiers had opposed Magellan's appointment and predicted that his foreign origins would create discipline problems that could destroy the expedition's chances of success. These letters demonstrate that Spanish opposition to Portuguese leadership extended far beyond the sailors who would actually participate in the voyage. Portuguese King Manuel I responded to Magellan's defection by dispatching 2 caravels with orders to intercept the Spanish expedition and prevent his former subject from revealing Portuguese navigation secrets to Spain. These pursuit vessels added external pressure that complicated Magellan's internal problems with crew loyalty and increased the stakes for everyone. Aboard the Spanish expedition, Portuguese agents operating in Spanish ports gathered intelligence about the expedition's departure schedule and planned routes, creating security concerns that forced Magellan to implement additional secrecy measures. The threat of Portuguese interception meant that crew members faced potential capture and imprisonment if Portuguese forces succeeded in stopping the expedition before it could escape European waters. Research conducted in 2025 has revealed the diverse economic motivations that drove individual crew members to join Magellan's expedition despite the obvious risks and uncertain prospects for success. Analysis of financial records shows that some sailors joined because they faced debts or legal problems that made leaving Europe attractive, regardless of the expedition's ultimate destination. Other crew members were motivated by promises of shares in any profits generated by discovering new trade routes or territories that could be claimed for Spanish exploitation. The research demonstrates that crew loyalty depended largely on whether individual sailors believed the expedition would improve their personal financial situations, rather than abstract concepts of national service or exploration for scientific purposes. These internal divisions created by national tensions, economic pressures, and competing loyalties threatened to destroy Magellan's expedition before the ships could even reach the open Atlantic. The combination of Spanish resentment toward Portuguese leadership, crew diversity that complicated communication and discipline, and external threats from Portuguese pursuit vessels established conditions where serious challenges to command seemed inevitable. As the expedition prepared for departure, Magellan faced the daunting task of maintaining authority over men who questioned his loyalty while managing political pressures that could turn crew members against each other. The success of his mission would depend on whether he could hold this fractured fleet together long enough to prove that western routes to Asia were possible.